that I am Anthony Stacey. I'm the prof here at the business school, responsible for particularly the MBA program and the research component of that. What I'm planning to do this morning is to set the scene as to what it is that you're participating in when you supervise the MBA research project. In 2016, we changed our curriculum here. So those of you that did do an MBA here prior to 2016, you'd have been familiar with the research component, which was a research report. It counted 33% of the degree, and we did that for many, many years. At that stage, the MBA degree was actually at NQF level 8. Now that's an honours level degree, and it accrued subsidy at that level, and it was never deemed academically to be a full-blown master's. And that was partly because the research component was only 33%, whereas a coursework master's would normally have a 50% research component. What happened in 2016 is the legislation around the MBA program changed, and the MBA was recategorized and reclassified as a professional degree as opposed to being an academic degree. Right? So it changed over. So this whole new stream of qualifications opened up, and we now had this professional qualification. As such, the requirement for the research changed. And instead of being a 33% research component, what was recast as a 25% independent study component. Right, so it was reframed from being research to being independent study. And then the various business schools had the option as to how they've formulated that 25%. Also happened at the time in 2016 is that the MBA was reclassified as an NQF level 9 qualification. So in other words, a full-blown master's qualification. So the confusion then came in as how the research component is different. It's smaller in magnitude, but the intellectual and academic expectations are greater. All right, and so getting that trade-off is a bit of a balance that we had to work on in the early stages of the program. And as a result of that whole reframing, designed into the curriculum were these 4 formats. All right, so the 4 formats that we've got are a research article. Now, originally we called that a research report. All right, and that's where some confusion came in. All right, because we were calling it the same thing, and yet it was substantially different. It was about a third of the size, but intellectually potentially more challenging. So we've now referred to that as the research article, and I'll talk more about that in a second. We've got the consultancy report, we've got a business venture proposal, and we've got a social entrepreneurship project. The point about those 4 formats is that it was intended to be more obviously applied, but it was intended to, because the degree is now a professional degree, it was really intended to bridge the gap between what happens in the classroom and what happens in their future careers. So it was intended to create the transition and the pathway more explicitly than the research report had been able to do previously. So that was the rationale for the change. And so we've now got these 4 formats, and I think they've evolved a little bit over the past 2 years, but I think we've got to a point now where we're fairly clear about what's expected in each of those different formats. And that's what I'd like to take you through now, is kind of what's expected and what differentiates one format from the other. Because they are distinct, but some of them are quite closely linked, in fact. Let me start off then with the research article, because that is the one that probably most people are fairly familiar with. So the purpose of the research article is to prepare a manuscript that could be submitted for publication in a journal. So that's essentially what we're looking at there. So that is closest to the old research report, but it's much shorter, and we're specifying 12 to 15,000 words. Now, in fact, most journals will require something to be somewhat shorter than that. We got that 12 to 15,000 words from some of the sort of top publications, international publications. It's kind of a top end as to what's expected. And all of the formats, in fact, have this word limit. Okay, so it's 12 to 15,000 words, whichever format one chooses. All right. Well, not yourselves, but obviously the student. And what we've tried to do, and you'll see this coming through, is that we've tried to get consistency in the expectations and the demands of the different formats, even though they are targeted differently. So the research article is targeted at readers of a journal, a particular journal. So in other words, the student will need to choose a target journal because their article needs to be formatted and framed for the readership of that journal. And in order to get potentially selected for publication, it would obviously need to appeal to the editors of that journal. So that one of the early things that students would need to do is to identify an appropriate journal for publication. It then gets prepared using the basic layout and the structure of a journal article. And the difference between that and a traditional dissertation, research report, or thesis is that it's much more compact. The literature review is going to be much tighter. You don't have to demonstrate a vast competence in the particular field. So it's a much tighter piece of work, and fully acknowledging that in fact it's sometimes easier to write a long-winded piece of work than it is to write a shorter piece of work, all right, because it's got to be more compact and efficient. But that is consistent with the requirements of it being a full-blown NQF Level 9 master's piece of work. All right. So that's going to be one of the major differences that we'll see, is it's much tighter, it's much more focused. The important thing is that it is targeted at essentially an academic audience, all right? Academic journal readership. The publication of the article is not part of the process, all right? So the examination process does not include publication of the article. So it's about preparing the manuscript, getting it examined, and then the student and the supervisor have a choice about whether they actually go ahead and publish it.
Do you require the student to follow the outline of the requirements of the journal? Because all the journals say that they've got to have this sort of layout, this sort of font, etc., etc. And would that be an appendix within the report?
So we expect them to follow the basic structure in terms of, whether it's an introduction, normally it would be some sort of introduction, some sort of theory base, and so on. But the sort of the heading structure, the level of detail, that we do expect them to use that as their guideline. That's why we don't provide a template, all right? Because we want them, as one would if you're going for publication, we want them to follow the editorial guidelines,
yeah.
Right?
But
So
the journals are very specific about what they will accept.
Yeah.
And that's what is part of the...
I'm not too fussed about the font size and the column widths and things like that. I'm not too fussed about that. And the word count, we're saying we're overriding that, because if the journal word count is 6,000 to 8,000 words, we are still expecting 12 to 15. We're also saying APA standard referencing rather than, let's say, Harvard or something like that. But with referencing software, that's a drop down and it's resorted. So, but basically the sort of the emphasis and the how theoretical it is maybe, and how much emphasis there is on quantitative or qualitative research. Some journals will have preferences around that. Those guidelines we are expecting them to follow. And that's, as I say, why we don't have a strict template.
Yeah, I was wondering if their interpretation and their ability to follow the journal's requirements was part of the requirement of the report.
It is a requirement. We do expect that. And the reason is that, in my experience as an academic, one of the reasons why manuscripts don't get published is if you don't follow the guidelines. So that's part of the process, the learning process for a new academic, in a sense, is to actually comply with those guidelines and follow those guidelines. So we are expecting them to do that, yes.
As a supervisor, how do I know that they're doing it?
All right, so they must have nominated the journal. All right, that's important. They can't just say, oh, I'm going to publish in an HR journal. All right, it needs to be a specific one. and they need to have looked up what the editorial requirements are, and they must share, they can share that with you, and then you can check them against it. In fact, we'll talk about this later, but one of the main roles of you as supervisors is going to be to interrogate the student, to ask them questions about what they've done and check that they're on track. It's not your responsibility to ensure that they have done it, all right? That's their problem, all right? But you need to ask the questions. So we'll talk a bit later about the evaluation criteria. So it's up, I would see your role as to say, right, where in your proposal, for example, have you demonstrated the integration of different management theories? All right, and it's that sort of challenging and interrogating rather than telling them, well, that's how you need to do it. Okay.
Are you saying at this stage they should have already nominated a journal in which they're intending to potentially publish the article, or at what point does that decision need to be made?
Okay, that decision needs to be made during preparation of their proposal. Absolutely, because the proposal needs to follow that format as well. And typically the proposal is going to be the first 3 sections of the article. So the first 3 sections are typically going to be sort of introduction and a context, then some sort of review of theory, literature review, and then some sort of methodology, how one's going to collect the data and analyze it, all right, or a description of that. So that's what the proposal is going to be, and they must, by that stage, have identified a journal. It's actually part of the template that I do provide. There's a title page, then the next page just with some basic data, sort of metadata, which journal is it going to be published in, all right, and then it goes into the substance of it. Okay, so yes, definitely they should have, and that's why I say pretty early on they need to have identified that. So what I've said to them is that in terms of appendices, generally a research article won't have appendices, but these days with electronic publishing, you get the opportunity to submit supplementary files. So I encourage them to, rather than having appendices, to submit supplementary files. So things like their survey or maybe detailed statistical output that they can attach as supplementary files rather than as appendices. So we're looking at a fairly tight piece of work, but that 15,000 does include references, yes.
And it includes the supplementary files now?
No, I'm saying that we're happy to leave the supplementary files out, because typically those would then be published online rather than published in the journal. I think one of the problems that we're having is that the template that we've given, all right, it's very generic. And so we outline a whole lot of stuff that we think might be in the proposal, but it's not prescriptive, and I think the students are taking it as being too prescriptive. So, we'll say that you need to talk about reliability and validity, okay? And traditionally, we might have had a whole section on that, with some subheadings and that sort of thing. And now we're saying, well, you need to touch on reliability and validity, but it's not a major section. It might be a 1 or 2 liner that has to be in there. And I think the students are taking that template too literally. All right, and so I think that's something that you can take with you, is that it's not a checklist that you've got to tick every box. Is this applicable? If so, include it. It's kind of it's just a reminder of issues that you might want to cover rather than an obligation. But in that sense, the journal guidelines should be followed. Okay. One of the things that I have said to the students is that they need to think about the readership of this very carefully. And the point about a research article is it is generally expected to in some way contribute to knowledge, because otherwise people are not going to read it, or the readership is going to be very narrow and focused. And editors are not going to publish an article if it's only going to be of interest to a small range of readers. So the idea of a research article is that the findings and the recommendations are going to be relatively widely applicable. Now I say that because in contrast to the next format that I want to mention, and that is the consultancy report. So historically we found a number of research reports were using case study method, and that's perfectly okay. But looking at case studies, often you'll find that the outcome of a case study is really only applicable to the organization in which the case study was carried out. in that instance, we would probably recommend that the student then follows the consultancy format, the consultancy report. The difference then between the consultancy report and the research article is then who it's targeted at, because the consultancy report is then going to be targeted at the management or the executives of that organization. And the other thing is that a consultancy report will typically have a very specific problem which needs a solution in the given context. All right. So I'm not saying that case study research can't be used in a research article. It can be. But the outcome of that needs to be of generic interest. So let's say one was doing a case study within the mining industry. If the results of that case study are applicable throughout the mining industry, that can still be a research article. All right? As a case study, its findings might be sufficiently generic. But more typically, a case study will be about solving a specific problem or finding the recommended solution for a very specific problem, and we would then recommend that the student go for a consultancy report, all right, as opposed to the research article. That is then not targeted at a publication. That is now targeted at the company itself. And the words that are going to be used and the framing of the work, the entire project, will be somewhat different. And it needs to be. However, the logic of it, and when I say the logic, what I mean is the kind of the sequence, the intellectual logic of it, is going to be very, very similar. And by that, what I mean is that you will have a problem and a scoping of the problem right up front. That's kind of your section 1. You're going to have some theory that you can apply to that problem in the context of that organization or that industry. You're then going to get to collect some data and analyze the data so that when the student gets to the point of making their recommendations about the solution and justifying their recommended solution, it is based in theory and in data. And you'll see that logical kind of progression is pretty much the same as one would expect in a research article, right? So it's very, very important for the student realizes that what we're looking for in the consultancy report is not about their opinion on something. It is that they make a recommendation that is rooted in and substantiated by both theory and data collection. And that's what we're expecting. And that's one of the ways in which we're getting consistency across the different formats. Because now the basic demands of a research article are going to be very, very similar to the demands being made of a research article.
So the statistical analysis that's going to be done, is it of the same, what you could say, standard as you would be expecting from a research article?
It might well be, okay, but not necessarily the case, all right, because it is going to be more specific, so they need to choose their methodology as appropriate. But the intellectual requirements are no different, so that's why I'm saying potentially they will be exactly the same. But the important thing is that what they end up with is going to be the recommendations that are substantiated by theory and by data, which is exactly what one would get in a research article. I think that there's been quite a lot of confusion around the consultancy report, and what I usually find with students is that they're trying to tackle too much. So they're trying to be a one-man McKinsey's, all right? And that's not going to work. You can't tackle all the problems of an entire organization. It's got to be one very specific, narrowly focused problem. And again, that's the first question that I ask them every time. What is the problem that you're going to recommend a solution to? And in my experience in organizations, that's why organizations call in consultants, because there's not the big McKinseys of the world, because that's usually a big intervention of some sort, but they're calling the consultants who has the expertise to solve or recommend the solution to a given specific and narrowly focused problem. And that's how I try and frame it. Obviously, they're tending to choose problems within their own organizations, and that's absolutely 100%. We have no problem with that at all. But they sometimes find it difficult to then distance themselves to become the consultant to their own organization. And so that's been a bit of a challenge, and I try and sort of almost do a role play with them and say, right, if you were to call in a consultant, how would you define your problem within your company? Right, now use that as the scope for your project. So change roles now and become the consultant and solve that problem. So some of them have quite a lot of difficulty in the framing around that. What I'm saying is, for a consultancy report, I want to know what the problem is that they're going to solve. All right. Whereas with a research article, we talk about the problem statement, which is really about doing something that contributes to understanding and knowledge in that field. Okay. So a research problem might be to identify and describe factors that influence purchase decisions of millennials. All right. That would be a research article. All right. How this organization markets to millennials, that becomes a consultancy report that's specific to that organization and doesn't try to be generic. You see, it's when they work strictly within one organization and then try to be generic, that's where the external validity becomes a problem. And I would say no, that's not appropriate to frame it as a research article, because the external validity is compromised. So if they're doing a research article, I will ask them the question, all right, what is the deliverable in that article that you're writing? All right, so why will people read the article that you're going to produce? What insight, what knowledge are they going to gain by reading that? Because the problem statement of a research article, or the research objective, needs to set that up, and that becomes the scoping of the research article. And they do struggle with that. All right, and in fact, I spend a whole session on exactly that issue. I workshop it with different examples with the students to give them guidance on how one can be specific, even though your findings are going to be of general interest in a research problem. It's something that is very difficult for somebody that hasn't done research before to really appreciate. And so we literally spend a whole session doing the scoping exercise, working with examples from the students in class. They get to critique it and so on.
So this student wants to address millennials at this retailing organization at which he works. By the way, he also wants to address multi-channel marketing. So I thought that was great. Millennials, omnichannel marketing to millennials. Now, can his topic be, how can we target this segment better? See, it's almost not a specific question. It's because there's a broad range of things that could go into it. You know, how are we going to market? How are we going to communicate? What our product offering is? There's a whole lot of things, and he hasn't addressed a specific.
Yeah. My argument is that the question as to how one can do it is rooted in a problem. You can't just ask the question. There must be a reason you're asking that question. Okay. So I would say get back to the actual question, the problem that needs a solution. What I've found, and this may apply in what you're describing there, is that often students will be doing a consultancy report where they already have the solution in mind. Okay. And that they will be using it to justify the solution. And that's where there's a huge problem about that, because and the sort of question that you ask, how can we use a particular approach to the market, right, means that they've already solved the problem in their mind. And the idea of this process of having theory and data to go to substantiate one's final recommendations is that you go in with an open mind about how to solve the problem, all right, and not going in with a predetermined expectation of the solution. Right? It might be that is the optimal solution, but not necessarily. All right? And we're looking for a level of rigor that says, let's define what the real problem is, all right? And let's examine what the potential solutions to that would be through the theory, through the data, and let's see whether in fact that is the outcome and is that the best one. All right? So that's what worries me about it, framing it as a question the way you have, is that it often implies a predetermined expected outcome, and that's problematic.
Yeah.
I prefer it to be a problem that needs a solution. Okay.
But then this student in this case could address, how can we market to the millennials? How can we reach our millennials target segment better?
Yeah, but that implies that there's a problem. That implies there's a problem.
I agree.
And that's what I'm saying, is let's get to the problem rather, because there might be other issues around that. So that's what I don't want to be absolutely rigid about it, but my experience is that it's much clearer if one can focus it on what is the problem.
So I am a management consultant. So
Okay.
that what you would want to do is know, why is the student asking the question? Is it because they're finding that there's an issue with their profit margins at the moment? Is there an untapped market? Are they finding that in other research that they're doing, this is coming out as a gap? Is there something that's coming out from a specific department that's saying we can't reach our targets because we're not looking at millennials? Kind of coach your student through that to understand what the problem is. Then once that's framed, that question has context, and then it becomes a consulting report, right? Because then you're saying we need to look at or investigate our approach to millennials in the organization, this retail organization, to know if it's a viable option to focus on this particular market to improve profit margins, as an example.
Yeah, another thing that I find quite disturbing is that even when the students come for a research article, you will find that in many instances they are overly descriptive rather than critical or analytical.
Yes.
Whereas that could probably sit well in a consultancy report than in the research article, where they need to be analytical and critical rather than just being descriptive. Because if they become descriptive, then it becomes something that would not interest anyone in a general that they have identified.
I think you've identified a problem that we are aware of, and that is that that students are getting to this stage of their academic career, and they lack some of the analytical skills and the analytical thinking that they need. I think that that's a generic thing. I'm not sure that I would agree that the consultancy report is more descriptive. I think we're looking for the analytical side as well, and the robustness of the analysis. But there's more flexibility, maybe. Yeah, there is. One of the things, one of the sessions we cover is the requirements of the NQF Level 9 qualification. And it's usually quite a frightening experience for the students, because they suddenly realize what is expected of them in terms of their level of analysis and so on. So it's quite sobering for them. What you'll find is that the evaluation criteria, which are in the document that I've circulated, those are pitched at NQF Level 9. So there's kind of a consistency there. But the NQF Level 9 requirements are obviously very generic, because they cover all master's degrees. It really is very demanding, and so my suspicion is that you're not expecting too much.
Do you discuss with the students in terms of the time frames and what is their role in because I find some students still expecting me to do the work for them.
It is something that is actually unfortunately very common. So the students' expectations of their supervisors is quite unrealistic. I had a student, we were discussing expectations of supervisors in class a few months back, and a student said to me, "But Anthony, we depend very heavily on our supervisor." And I said to him, "This is the independent study component of your degree. That means, by definition, you shouldn't be depending on your supervisor." All right, and I say very explicitly to them that you as supervisors are not there to teach them. All right, that is absolutely not your role. It's broad guidance. It's challenging questioning, as I spoke about earlier. And your role is absolutely not to teach them. They carry full responsibility for that submission that they're going to make. The only time where you carry some responsibility, if I could put it that way, is after the examination process. In the research article, if you're going to publication, then you can contribute to that article, because you're going to be a co-author in it. All right, so you can actually, if you feel it's necessary to write a portion of it and contribute as co-author, then you could, by all means, you can do so. But up to that point, certainly up to the examination, you carry no responsibility for the content of it whatsoever. All right, and so that's very clear to the students, but they're going to try their luck. But remember, it's the independent study component. They need to work independently, and that's where the NQF level requirements are very explicit. At master's level, there's got to be a level of thought that is independent, it's creative, it's innovative, it's all of those things, and it comes from them, not from yourself.
I'm a librarian. I teach the students how to find stuff. Okay? So when they tell you they can't find anything, They're talking bosh. Their needs, the quick and dirty, is to customize their scholarship, which is easy. And I go through it in the class with them, and I can do it with you as well, so you know. But they have access to an enormous number of databases through the library homepage, provide they create a pin for themselves. And they can do this thing on the beach, or in London, or on the moon. They can access databases. There's no restriction.
What I did with my students is that I broke it down into like 4 stages so that we're able to go through the whole entire literature review part and the research question and the rest of it. So it's all like sort of set out in certain timelines and dates, right? But I got from my student that was not also available from December, and they set out their own timelines, and the first timeline was 2nd week of January. We've not been able to meet to date. I've communicated on email. I got a 6-page document that had references. There was no reference list. There's no format to it. It's basically a whole entire page. So I asked if they've gone through a proper class where there's a format and whatnot, and they said no. And they said they can't find it in the library as well.
You know, I mean, all that information is available to them. We've either discussed it, it's on the e-learning platform, Sakai. So there's a lot of nonsense being spoken around, I'm afraid. Okay, so they get very defensive, and yes, they're under a lot of pressure generally and so on, I accept that, but take what they're saying with a pinch of salt. They have been, that's why I want to go through sort of just very briefly what I do touch on, because they have been taken through it. Whether they've been at that lecture or not, of course, and whether they've taken it in, whether they were checking their emails during lecture, I can't say. So one of the things that I'd say to them very, very explicitly, and even to the point where they sign a document on this, that they are responsible for managing the relationship between themselves and the supervisor. All right? So what I say to them is the first engagement that they have with their supervisor, they need to talk about what expectations are. And then you need to get agreement, a mutual agreement that says, in terms of turnaround times, in terms of guidance, in terms of how you're going to operate. All right? Now, my experience is they don't do that.
Gentleman's giving of having gone through that process and they're not adhering to that. What then?
Okay, so it becomes their responsibility. If they miss the deadline, they're going to have to pay fees for an extra year, and it's their problem. And I really, I'm quite firm on this, by the way, that I don't want you taking responsibility for that, because then they're going to hide behind that. And it's the same thing with plagiarism, all right? And where we've been very, very diligent about it, and the students will almost inevitably say, but my supervisor didn't pick it up, or I thought my supervisor approved it. It's got nothing to do with the fact that they are responsible for it. They are responsible for the final submission that they make in its entirety. Okay, so as soon as we, as supervisors, we accept some responsibility, we're going to be digging our own grave. And so that's why I'm being quite firm on that and saying, I don't want you to take responsibility. Okay? The only point where you can, and we haven't implemented that for this year, but for next year we're going to be implementing this, the only point of accountability would be that if it's reaching the deadline and you for whatever reason have been unavailable, all right, that I would ask you to apply for an extension for the student if you are prepared to say, I wasn't available for 6 weeks over because I was traveling or whatever it is, that you put that on paper and you say, I want my student to have extra time because I wasn't available. That's the only level of accountability that I'm talking about. Beyond that, it's up to the student. So by all means, if you have I'm not saying don't follow up with your student if that's the way you like to work. That's 100%, but the student mustn't feel that they can depend on that at any level. And as I say, I'm being very firm on that one, because of the problems that comes about. As soon as we start looking at joint accountability, then fingers get pointed and it gets very messy.
Is it possible perhaps you said they signed a document with the responsibility,
yes,
to have access?
Okay, so what I do is I give them 2 copies of this in their first session. All right, they sign one and they keep one for exactly what you're saying. So ask them for that copy.
Oh.
Okay, ask them for that copy. It's also available on the e-learning platform, so no problem with that.
is it feasible, and would you recommend as a supervisor for them to go ahead with a report if the company is concerned about confidentiality issues and they're not wanting their name?
Okay. Usually we can deal with confidentiality issues by just not naming the company. All right, sometimes it becomes a bit obvious. There are some situations where the confidentiality is problematic and the student, and would almost preclude the student from doing it. So if there is an issue about confidentiality, the student needs to address that very early on. All right, that's our recommendation. The process of embargoing research is possible. All right, the university would be prepared to embargo under certain circumstances for a 2-year period. It is a process that requires ratification by the Senate Higher Degrees Committee. I always strongly recommend against it, partly because of the delays in the process, and apart from anything else, it's only for 2 years anyway. The only time that I know that it has been done when I was serving on that committee it wasn't from the business school at all. It was when somebody had done some research, I think in the social sciences, around a gang activity on the Cape Flats, and the researcher's life was in danger. So the university is in the business of knowledge creation, and they really don't like the embargo route. Okay, so anonymizing it is kind of a first step. Changing some of the numbers potentially, multiplying by the square root of pi or whatever it is another alternative. But a full-blown embargo for that period of 2 years, I try and avoid it as far as possible. But it is technically an option.